A bit over 4 years ago, in February 2018, I told you that polarization needs to be embraced. Not only because it makes no sense whatsoever to look for compromise and reason with loonies, but also because it makes strategic sense. It forces the opposition essentially to realign, and it's usually a net gain. Usually, not always. Still, worth the risk. So, fortunately, a strong enough amount of non-leftists headed into the direction that I suggested. So, how's it going? It's been 4 years. Is it working? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. I'm taping something outside because finally the weather has resolved. For the entirety of 2022 so far, the weather has been mostly terrible. Either it was raining or it was too damn cold. All the way till late May, really. It was really damn cold. So, finally the weather is nice. And, I've been waiting for this for more than 9 months. So, yeah. Okay. So, I stumbled upon a piece of news that made me laugh. And not only made me laugh, but also reminded me of this topic. So, I thought I'd maybe revise this topic a little bit because, it seems to be working. Not entirely 100% as I predicted, but very close to it for sure. So, I took papers with me, of course, because, I'm not a techno-optimist. I think it's from Redux. Of course, links will be in the description, and you'll see something nice on the screen, and yada, yada, yada. A Norwegian feminist could be facing up to 3 years in prison for allegedly hateful tweets directed at a male who claims to be a lesbian woman. Honk, honk. Christina Ellingsen, a representative of feminist organization Women's Declaration International, is being investigated under hate crime charges for tweets she made between February 2021 and January 2022. The tweets in question were replies directed at Christine Marie Jentoft, a representative of trans activist group Foreningen FRI. Jentoft is a male who identifies as a lesbian woman. Ellingsen's charges are centered around her questioning why FRI promoted the belief that men could be lesbians. While police are still investigating, if she is found guilty, Ellingsen could face a prison sentence of up to 3 years. Goodness me. Norway introduced gender identity into the hate crime paragraphs in January 2021. At the time, WDI Norway, formerly the Women's Human Rights Campaign Norway, warned that the introduction of the concept into law would result in persecution of women for stating biological facts. A second tweet that has been cited as evidence of hate speech reads, quote, Jentoft, who is male and an advisor in FRI, presents himself as a lesbian. That's how bonkers the organization which supposedly works to protect young lesbians' interests is. How does it help young lesbians when males claim to be lesbian too? Ellingsen was recently accused by Amnesty International Norway of harassing Jentoft after telling him on national television that he was male. You are a man, you cannot be a mother, Ellingsen had said. To normalize the idea that men can be mothers is a defined form of discrimination against women, unquote. Honk, honk. So the FRI mentioned in the article is Foreningen for Kjønns- og seksualitetsmangfold, or the Norwegian Organization for Sexual Diversity, Sexual and Gender Diversity, technically gender and sexual diversity, whatever. FRI used to be called in the past Landsforeningen for lesbiske, homofile, bifile og transpersoner. I don't think that needs translation. So essentially the former lobby, the former LGBTs lobby, became entirely the trans lobby in Norway. And everyone not on board with biology denialism went on to co-opt a dormant feminist organization, which is not great, not terrible. I mean, it's not the greatest scenario, but certainly not the worst either. I mean, the worst would have been for the, pro-biology part to just shut up, like it happened in several other countries. And, up until recently, the United States itself had a form of corridor of opinion. Now, admittedly, nowhere near as all-encompassing as the Swedish corridor of opinion on immigration, which fell several years ago. But this one is a bit wider because, it's not just Norway anymore, and it's not just Scandinavia anymore. And even within Scandinavia, we've started seeing some very interesting differences. For instance, Sweden, as well as Finland, outright banned the whole trans kids bollocks. And the United Kingdom is slowly, not at the pace that I would love, but slowly sleepwalking into that as well. Which is, of course, great, but it makes the leftists in other countries of Europe, outside Scandinavia and, the United Kingdom in a way, the discussion is less spectacular, but nevertheless it exists. And it's not exactly going the way that trans activists would have wanted it to go. For instance, in Germany, the trans activists are complaining that even though they got a little bit of what they wanted, in the end, not really. And they say that the policies are still too restrictive. Nevertheless, what I'm trying to say is that the discussion is, for the first time, really, since this topic became a thing in legislation, which was 15 or 20 years ago, depending on the country. For the first time, it's not going in the same direction. It started going in the other direction as well. And that's, of course, pissing off all the right people, which is why it's great. But then again, this whole discussion, at least in Europe, takes place only in West Europe. In Eastern Europe, where, let's say we have bigger problems, such as that big thing called the war, which is just next door, just about 120 linear kilometers from where I'm taping this. So there's that. And also, besides the war, we're also not brutally insane as a population, or at least not to the extent West Europe is. So, this discussion is still, and this is something that you can always remind when you're debating leftists in public. And don't debate leftists when there is no audience. But if you're debating leftists in public, you should remind them always that this discussion exists on a tiny minority of the planet's population. This discussion isn't a thing in China, isn't a thing in India, isn't a thing in Russia, isn't a thing in Africa, isn't a thing in Brazil, isn't a thing in Chile, it isn't a thing in Mexico, isn't a thing really almost anywhere. It's a thing in a tiny minority of places that have had it so well that they can afford to question biology, essentially, and not doing a good job at it. So there's that. Anyway, this topic is not new. So this is another aspect that everyone should remember. This topic is not new. It's been bubbling under the surface for quite some time. So, for instance, I will remind you the Norwegian docu-series Hjernevask, The Brainwash, made 12 years ago, published 12 years ago, filmed 13 years ago. In 2010 it was published, made by a comedian, I forgot his name, but and specifically, I mean, it had 7 or 8 episodes, and the first episode, called Likestillingsparadoxet, the gender equality paradox, specifically deals with not just with feminism, but also these questions of gender identity, gender expression, whatever, and it just mops the floor with both feminism and transgenderism in ways that at least academic feminism had real trouble recovering from, and some feminist academic departments, especially those that were interviewed in the series, never recovered. So there's that. So 12 years down the line, and now there's this shit in Norway. Admittedly, it also happens partly what I predicted back in 2015. So, older subscribers might remember. Newer ones should just look for the video titled "Norway to Allow Gender Change at the Age of 7." I published a video title like that. It's in a terrible quality because that's how things used to roll. It's with that ugly wardrobe in July 2015. And I was saying then that since that policy was going to happen, and it did, people should be trolling the bureaucracies into oblivion. And I was suggesting a few tactics there. Very few people were willing to try them for whatever reason. I guess the main reason being janteloven, but I'll skip my disdain for Scandinavian collectivism for now. But although it didn't happen at the scale that I wanted in the way that I suggested it, the bureaucracies were trolled nonetheless. I mean, they were. Just think about it for a little bit. If this case of this Norwegian feminist goes to trial, the judge has to effectively either make feminism illegal, or at the very least an untenable position legally, or to uphold feminism and her right to say that dude is a dude, in which case the judge would be giving the boot to the entirety of the transgenderist lobby. I mean, I would grab popcorn if I were following more closely the politics in Norway. Well, I will grab popcorn anyway. I'm looking forward for the trial. Because, at some point, a line has to be drawn. And, this particular lady, and, I don't support this particular lady because the organization that she represents is, comparable to the Swedish organization called ROX. Some of you might remember it. In 2005, I think, it was that documentary called Könskriget, the gender war. And the two organizations were profiled then. ROX, Riksorganisationen för kvinnor och tjejer i Sverige, the National Organization for Women and Girls in Sweden, and Bellas Vänner, Bella's Friends. Two highly militant misandrist organizations. Well, this lady that is now stands accused of transphobia, I guess, is of the same kind of persuasion. She's a militant misandrist, a true hater. So, she doesn't come from a position of reason. She does come from a position of misandry. Nevertheless, even though her intentions are far from noble and far from willing to, uphold reason, she's still correct. That dude is a dude. And, as hateful as these people are, she does have a point. I mean, if anyone can identify as a lesbian, and then that means anyone can identify as a woman, and if anyone can identify as a woman, then that means you cannot, in practice, not only, both de facto and de jure, you cannot have sex-based policies. You just can't. Because it would become essentially untenable. So, and of course, they're fighting to protect their privileges, obviously, because, their funding comes, they're called the Women's Human Rights Campaign. So, if anyone can be a woman, then that's only a human rights campaign, and there's plenty of that, a lot of competition, and basically her business would be down the drain. On the other hand, she does have a point that, that dude is a dude. This is the dude is a dude. Come on. In any event, and then there is more recently, this topic bubbled again into quasi-mainstream-ish with Matt Walsh's film What is a Woman, published by the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire staying true to their word and using that $100 million that they had raised into producing normie-friendly, conservative-leaning content, entertainment, I meant. I haven't seen the entirety of Matt Walsh's film, but I did see enough of it to not only to say that it is comparable to the docu-series of 12 years ago, but also to say that it is lighthearted, quite funny, very normie-friendly, great to show, great for this occasion. It's very good. You can just show it to your normie friends who have no idea about any of this shit, who haven't seen any of the of the battles that occurred with or against gender ideologues. So it's very good for that. And if the movie is a success, and it might be, I don't know, then it's kind of game over. I mean, the separation will be complete and will become apparent much sooner than anyone really dares to think. I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos' campaign #DropTheT from 6 or 7 years ago may likely happen much sooner than anyone imagined, and it's going to be irreversible. So, fingers crossed for Matt Walsh's film, really. I mean, if it becomes a success, if the mainstream starts discussing about it at length, not just mentioning it in passing, then it's done. It's a done deal. The separation between the LGB and the rest of the letters will be, well, not necessarily permanent, but it will be for a generation at the very least. I mean, it just is what it is. And we already see that happening in ways that frighten the activists, especially the trans activists and the wider far left. I mean, they're scaremongering against the laws in Texas or Florida or the policies in Sweden or Finland, places that effectively banned child mutilation, because that's really what gender-affirming care for children, that's really what it is. It's child mutilation. Let's not mince words here. But their scaremongering doesn't work. I mean, they would scream, "Oh no, they're blocking access to care for trans youth." And the reaction of the general public is like, meh, whatever. It's either a shrug or a support, a nod of approval for the measure itself. This would not have happened 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it would have been a controversial policy, even in conservative states. But now it's like, meh, whatever. And in fact, in some cases, some elements of the trans agenda are not just met with a shrug from the majority of the population, but a support from the majority of the population. I mean, even surveys made by left-wingers with asking people, do you agree with this measure? And they would list a paragraph from Ron DeSantis's bill meant to protect children from essentially grooming by activist teachers. And, most of the people, large majorities, 60-something, in some cases even 70% of Americans be like, yeah, actually it does make sense, Don't teach sexuality to 7-year-olds. It's just kind of haram to do it. Yeah? So there's that. But then the last thing that is going to have to happen, and not the last, but the next one. So, if Matt Walsh's film is a success, and I really hope it is, again, for cynical reasons, I don't have necessarily a high opinion of Matt Walsh, but, his film is good and is doing good work, so of course I'm going to endorse it. But as soon as this happens, the separation between LGB and the rest of the letters, the next one has to be race. And, race is going to be harder to split, but it must happen. Because whenever we play in the field of identity, we play by the rules set by the leftists. And it's nearly impossible to win with leftist rules. It's not entirely impossible. It can happen, and it has happened, even when we played on leftist rules. But it's amazingly hard, and it happens infrequently. So, you don't win 3 or 4 times in a row. At best, you win two times in a row, and even then it's a bit sketchy. But so you win infrequently when you play on leftist rules. But this is good enough for leftists. I mean, that's the best that they can hope for, to lose infrequently and, generally speaking, maintain a trend, even though they can't maintain consistent growth. But, it's the best that leftists can hope for. However, when we play in the field of values or in the field of concrete things, such as, for instance, now inflation, or generally in the field of values, when we play in that field, the opposite happens. The left wins infrequently, and we win most of the time. So that's why the separation of race and politics has to happen somehow. And if that's not possible, and I suspect it's not, at least not in the near future, at least the separation of the coalitions. So, that's why they must be split. And yes, oftentimes the process can be messy. I mean, you might have to work with crazy lesbians, like I did in France. Or you might have to work with groups that have really, really weird belief systems, I guess, and beliefs in general. I mean, one example that comes to mind, it's a very fringe one, but still it exists, like the black spirituals. You know, these are the people who believe in things like black energy, black in the racial sense, not like in the black magic kind of sense. No, in the racial sense. So, you know, these people are really weird, and they have very weird beliefs, but they also love weapons. They tend to have intact families and aren't into crime and have conservative values on education. So, you know, such groups must be co-opted. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it's a bit complicated. And yes, sometimes, you know, this happens on the left all the time. And, you know, on the right, we're going to have to also become accustomed to it because there is no other way. You know, sometimes you have members in your coalition that you're not really ashamed of, but you are a little bit, yeah, that's a bit corny, that's a bit cringe, but, you know, they're good people. That's kind of the attitude. But that's still, those are still segments that you'll have to co-opt, you know, like Glenn Youngkin did in Virginia, right, when he co-opted not just suburban moms, which, you know, those are a swing vote anyway, but also co-opted like highly educated Asians and several other smaller groups that would have been considered impossible to co-opt just merely 4 years before or 8 years before. No, you have to do it. So yeah, separate race or identity, racial identity, maybe I should say, from politics. And even if by pieces, it doesn't have to be all in one fell swoop. It's impossible to do it all in one fell swoop. And finally, we also have to do what we used to do very well 50 years ago, namely to get back business on our side. Slightly differently than how we've been doing it 20 years ago, but we have to get back business on our side. I mean, and this is mostly for Europeans. I mean, American conservatives are doing a very good job at this, but European conservatives barely limp along, and that's me being a bit generous, really. I mean, it's quite amazing. After the plethora of abuses committed by most European governments, under the excuse of the Wuhan flu. I mean, all of the affected businesses should be, well, how should I put this, nagged into oblivion with conservative talking points. I mean, it's quite amazing just how few European businesses are being pitched a conservative talking point. There is no reason for them not to support, yes, including financially, not just politically, not necessarily a traditional conservative party. I mean, in the case of Europe, of course, most of Europe is multi-party. But, you know, a kind of conservative party that I guess would be now called National Conservative in Europe or whatever other name, you know, a kind of Praво и Справедливоst type of party, or the kind of party like... like Vox in Spain, you know, those kinds of parties that are perceived as further to the right than mainstream right. But then again, the mainstream right in most of Europe is really center-left at this point, so you have to be further to the right than the mainstream quote-unquote right if you want to do right-wing politics. So, yeah. And after we split identity, and so, no, it's first the LGB from the rest of the letters. There will have to be race. Then we'll also have to split. I mean, we have to stop playing the class game. You know, I've seen some American conservatives doing a great job with that, but European conservatives are still lagging behind, as always. You know, separating it, separate the class game as well. Because again, when you play in class terms, you're playing on leftist rules. So stop bloody playing on leftist rules. Make them play on our rules. Because whenever we make them play on our rules, we almost always win. Yeah, sure, sometimes bad luck happens and whatnot, and we don't always win. But whenever the game is played in our terms, almost always we win. So, no. What do I mean by separating the class game? For starters, there should be no European conservative, especially European conservative, talking about layers of income. You don't talk about that, because Once you do that, you get into social social democratic stuff. And once you get into social democratic stuff, then you get stuck into nonsensical arguments or arguments that are really besides the point. So, we're starting to discuss, for instance, the threshold of taxation and whatnot. Well, who cares? And the reason I say this is because I'm sure most of you have already figured it out. If you haven't time to figure it out, you don't win elections on policy. You just don't. You win elections on emotion. And creating an emotion, you don't do that by discussing, we're going to reduce the flat tax rate from 16% to 10%, or we're going to do some, a progressive taxation system with the lower threshold at 0% and the higher threshold at 10%. Yeah, whatever. If anyone asks about that, I'm not saying don't have policies, of course. If anyone asks about that, then sure. But generally, don't start with that. Don't discuss in class terms, because if you do, well, you're already on leftist turf, and it just made your life much more difficult. So that's why I like the American conservatives who don't play this kind of stupid game of black conservatives and Asian conservatives. And no. There's just conservatives. There's gun owners. No, there isn't black gun owners and Asian. No, there's just gun owners. We like all responsible gun owners. We like guns. We would like to have more guns, and we like the Second Amendment protected. Period. That's it. Don't get it into that. Let the left deal with that, because believe me, they do. Right as we speak, in leftist offices, there's panic. There really is panic because they do think in terms of social groups, as they put it. They really do think like that. And the more they think like that, the more they're getting afraid, because some of those social groups are slowly but consistently turning against them. So unless you're targeting specifically a social group, in which case of course you're gonna have to play a little bit on so-called identity, but unless you're doing that, do not waste your time on essentially on leftist framing. Because the more we separate identity of any kind, whether it's racial or sexuality or economic or whatever, the more we separate that from politics in campaign, in public speeches and whatnot, the faster we move the entire game on our set of rules when we play on values and maybe on policies if necessary, instead of playing on identity. So basically what I'm saying is refuse the framing of this set of policies, or this political party is for gays, and this set of policies is for men, and this no, they just don't do that. They'll do that, and it's a mistake that especially European conservatives have been committing for so long. And in the case of American conservatives, not only Donald Trump but also Ron DeSantis and a few others are showing that it is possible to just outright refuse the leftist framing and just use the set of values that, that can make America great and can make the world great. So there's that. All right. That will be pretty much it. So, all of these have been possible so far. All of these gains have been possible thanks to polarization. 12 years ago, it was... I was getting pushback even from conservatives when I would say, no, the framing should be normal people and biology deniers. And it's, but isn't that divisive? Yes, that's the point. Let's force them. Because whenever you do that, most of the people on their side, they're like, hold on a second, yes, that is biology denialism. And yeah, do I really want to hang out with biology denialists? Really? Is it really such a good idea? Maybe not. Same thing here. It has to be like that. Make them live up to their own book of rules while you refuse their book of rules. That's basically how it should be done. I don't know if it's clear enough. I hope it is. All right. So with all that being said, send me to the gulag, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers.